Buongiorno a tutti ragazzi, I'm Luca, professor of history and enthusiast of Italian culture, and today, as you can see, we talk about the country with the most Italians outside of Italy, Brazil.
Shortly after the Italian unification of 1861, nearly 16 million people left their country. As the Italian government was struggling to provide better living conditions, jobs and food to all its inhabitants, hundreds of thousands of them decided to leave the country. But at the beginning, the idea was not to stay abroad permanently. On the contrary, only men most of the times emigrated. They wanted to stay there 2-3 years, make some money, send it back home in order to help their families, the so-called remittances, and then eventually they would come back home too. But for millions of Italians, the story went very differently because many of them, for a number of reasons, settled permanently in their country of emigration, created new families, new communities that even today in 2024 are important parts of many countries, especially in the American hemisphere.
And this is why I am in front of the amazing Brazilian embassy in Rome, because I want to talk about Brazil, a country of more than 200 million inhabitants. 30 million of these people claim some kind of Italian origin. Today, most of the Italians live in the Sao Paulo region, in the southeast of the country. But the history of Brazilian Italians did not start in big cities, but in the countryside.
In fact, 95% of Italians who left Italy for Brazil were poor, landless farmers. And for the Italian government, actually, the idea of getting rid of them in order to ease the wobbly Italian national job market was very welcomed. But the incredible difference between, for example, the Italian American experience and the Brazilian American experience was that while Italian Americans overwhelmingly came from southern Italy, Italians who emigrated to Brazil were from the north, specifically mostly from the Veneto, Venice region. In fact, the historian of Venetian emigration, Emilio Franzina, in its book about the immigration of Italians to Brazil, wrote, "People could die of malnutrition, and polenta was the only food available for the rural classes. Beef was beyond imagination, and some people had never seen a piece of meat in their lives."
On the other side of the Atlantic, the Brazilian government, for a variety of reasons, was very happy to receive Italian immigrants.
First, Italians could definitely help taking care of the endless lands of the Brazilian territory, since slavery was abolished in 1888 and landowners were in desperate need of labor to help cultivating their lands. In fact, at the beginning, Italians were mostly sent to the coffee plantations in the Sao Paulo region, and from them they moved to the growing cities, and today one of the biggest cities in the world with more than 12 million inhabitants has around 6 million people who claim some kind of Italian origin. In fact, already at the time, the governor of the Sao Paulo region wrote, "If the owner of each house in Sao Paulo displayed the flag of their country of origin, Sao Paulo would look like an Italian city." And then there was a more cultural aspect, since the passage between the 19th and the 20th century was a period marked by theories such as social Darwinism or superiority among races. And these theories were very popular among many governments, including Brazil, because Brazil at the time was already a very multicultural, multi-ethnicity society with white Northern Europeans, white Southern Europeans, Mestizo people, black enslaved from Africa. So the idea of the Brazilian ruling class was to diminish the non-white people and increase the white people. So the arrival of Italians was very welcomed, and Italians were particularly good for this purpose because they were Southern European, Catholic, Latin speaking, Latin language speaking people, as the Portuguese and the Spanish. So very, very easy to integrate and then to assimilate in the Brazilian society. But this is not something that only the Brazilian government was trying to do. So importing people with a very similar cultural and ethnical background. This was typical of every colonial society at the time. For example, the United States. The US was a more Germanic, Protestant, Northern European society, so they tended to prefer immigrants with that kind of background, and this was exactly the reason why Italian Americans struggled a lot, way more compared to Italian Brazilians in integrating in the American society, because the American public opinion perceived them as inferior, racially and culturally inferior Southern Europeans, Catholic with darker skin. So it was a completely different journey compared to the Brazilian Italians. And because of these strong cultural ties and relatively flawless integration between Italian and Brazilians, many Italians got the Brazilian citizenship. But at the time, the Brazilian government did not allow people to have multiple nationalities. So Italians were to choose remain Italians or to become Brazilians for good. And actually, many of them decided to get the Brazilian citizenship and stay in Brazil for good, to create new families there and settle for good. This was also favored a lot by the fact that according to the Brazilian citizenship law known as Ius Soli, or law of the soil, if your sons are born in Brazil, even if their parents are not Brazilian, they will be automatically granted the Brazilian citizenship. And this was such a big incentive for Italians to know that even if they were not born in Brazil, their sons and daughters would automatically get the Brazilian citizenship. This was the same, and it is still the same, of what happens in the United States, where no matter where your parents are born, if you are born in the territory of the United States, you will be granted the American citizenship. On the opposite side, the Italian citizenship rule worked and works in a completely different way. It's called Ius Sanguinis, or law of the bloodline. Basically, it says that if your family and your parents are not Italian, even if you are born and raised in Italy, you do not get the Italian citizenship. You have to wait years, decades. You have to live in Italy for 20 years, and then, more or less, depending on the case, you will get the Italian citizenship. This is the opposite of the Ius Soli. And it says, on the contrary, that if you are born in Brazil, for example, and you have been Brazilian for generations, if you show that you have, for example, an Italian grandparents, you will be granted the Italian citizenship in the blink of an eye, or in a way shorter period than if you don't have any Italian bloodline. And this is the reason why so many Italian, for example, footballers, such as the European champion Jorginho or the Juventus manager Thiago Motta, They were not Italian, they were born in Brazil, from Brazilian families. They had never been in Italy before going there to play. They did not speak a word of Italian, but because of their Italian bloodline, they went to their local village in Veneto region. They did all a process, and in a relatively short period of time, they were granted the Italian citizenship. In fact, in Veneto region, where most of the Italian Brazilians are from, there are so many requests of Brazilians to get the Italian citizenship that these small town hall are overwhelmed by all these processes. And some people say, is it right that Italians that they are born in Italy but their parents are not Italians, they will never get the Italian citizenship, or they will get it after decades? And the people who did not speak Italian, who were, for example, completely American or completely Brazilians or completely Argentinians, just because they have the Italian bloodline, they are nearly automatically granted the Italian citizenship. Let me know in the comment what you think about it. But at the time when the Italian government at the end of the 19th century created this law, it made sense at the time, because they wanted to encourage sons and daughters of immigrants to go back to Italy after maybe a generation. And with this citizenship law, it was quite easy. So at the time it made sense. Now in 2024 it depends.
But a trip from Italy to Brazil in late 19th century was no joke, as Italians had no money whatsoever to start the travel. So there was an agreement between Italian and Brazilian government, with the involvement of Brazilian landowners who needed people to work on their fields, to lend money to Italians and pay shipping companies so that they could arrive to Brazil. The idea was that after several years, Italians working in Brazil would have been able to pay back the shipping companies. It was called sponsored migration.
But eventually this practice went rapidly out of control, since many Italians were not able to pay back their money. Others were exploited by Brazilian landowners, and so the Italian government, in order also to avoid the diplomatic issues with the Brazilians, decided to put a ban on this practice. It was 1902, the law was called the VENETI decree. And basically this law said that if you wanted to go to Brazil, you should have paid your ticket. There was no help anymore, and this actually led to a huge decrease in departures from Italy to Brazil.
The culture of Italian Brazilian was and still is completely different from the stereotype of the Italian American immigrant in the US, due to, as I said before, the fact that the Italians who went to Brazil were, most of the times, from northern Italy, with a completely different culture, identity, traditions such as food, language. So still today, Italian Brazilians look very different from the typical stereotype of the Italian American, which is based on a Southern Italian blueprint.
Now, to be more specific, in order to see through the assimilation that happened to Italians in Brazil, especially in big cities, if we want to see that northern Italian blueprint still alive in Brazil, we have to go to specific areas of the country, some of them outside of the big cities, where we can still notice some peculiar aspect of the northern Italian Brazilian culture. For example, the architecture of cities. There are some small villages and medium cities outside of the big metropolis in which the architecture is clearly similar to the architecture of Veneto region. Or, for example, as I mentioned before, food. That's the difference between, for example, Brazilian Italian food and Italian American is incredible. In Brazil, immigrants did not import pasta and pizza as Sicilian and Napolitans in New York, Boston, and other areas of the US. They imported typical foods of Northeast Italy, such as rice and polenta, which is something that you eat in northern Italy instead of pasta, is based on many cereals. And this is something that I think an Italian American has never heard of polenta. And even if you are an Italian living in Italy, polenta is something that you don't eat if you are not from Northeast Italy. Is extremely rare, and there are many other examples of the diet of Italian Brazilians that is very similar to the northeast of Italy. And if you wanna speak about these similarities, I think the dialect is an incredible story. In Brazil, there is a on the beautiful channel podcast Italiano, there is a beautiful video of the Italian, which is a Venetian dialect still spoken in Brazil. So while, for example, in the US you have still some people, some Italian Americans speaking Italian, they basically speak Sicilian, they speak Neapolitan. Instead, these people, they speak the Venetian dialect, the Italian, which is a very alive dialect spoken among these sons and daughters and granddaughters of immigrants.
And today there are countless famous Brazilians of Italian origins, such as the former president Jair Bolsonaro, Formula One drivers Ello and Felipe Massa, countless footballers. And if you look at their last names, you notice that most of them are from northern Italy. This is it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you like this kind of videos and if you want more material about the history of Italian immigration. And see you in the next one. Ciao ciao ragazzi.